one of the puzzles is what I call the overstory. And I really could have written a whole book on overstories. It's really the thing that captured my imagination while writing it. But it started because I got really interested in Miami. And Miami is this weird place, and it's weird for any number of reasons, but one of the weird things about Miami is that it is the Medicare fraud capital of America. It's also the capital of all kinds of fraud, but Medicare fraud is one of them. It's not just a little, Miami's not just a little bit different from other cities in this country in terms of how much fraud exists.
Malcolm, I want to start here. The Tipping Point, your first book, was wildly successful, right? And you've written a lot of books in between. And your book, in so many ways, makes sense of the kinds of sudden shifts in behaviors and beliefs that make up our world. What made you want to revisit The Tipping Point in this way?
Well, I was originally just going to do a 25th anniversary edition because it's been 25 years. And I read it and I realized I couldn't just update a book from 25 years ago, because if you're interested in epidemics and contagion and viral ideas, you can't, something you wrote in 2000 is just not going to work in 2025, right? I mean, it's like too much has happened specifically in that kind of, so I got kind of halfway through the revision and I said, I need to do a whole new book. I should do a sequel. So that was the, when I wrote Tipping Point at the end of the 90s, the idea that you could think about ideas as behaving like viruses, and that ideas, or that you could use the world of epidemics to explain behavior, was a novel idea. I didn't invent it, but it was a novel idea to many people. It is no longer novel. It's now the norm, right?
Sure.
The idea that something has gone viral has entered our vocabulary. So that's the difference. And so given, you can't I couldn't just put the same book out again. I'd have to, I thought I needed to start over and do a sequel.
And you talk about how we have to take these tipping points seriously, and that we need to meet these kinds of challenges in new and innovative ways. Tell me a little bit more about that.
I mean, in the original Tipping Point, I was concerned with, it opens with a story about shoes. I have books on sneakers, children's TV. I had some serious things I tackled there, but a lot of it was trying to understand really kind of, in many cases, how positive change spread. In this book, there is no, I'm not talking about sneakers anymore,
No.
Now it's, it is a darker book, but I think it's because 2024 is a darker moment than 2000. I mean, if you think back 25 years, 2000 was this moment of really quite extraordinary optimism. Cold War had ended, economy was booming, we were, it was lots of people we were poised to make a whole series of extraordinary strides in lifting people out of poverty, ending the crime wave that had engulfed America for decades. I mean, there were all these extraordinary things going on. And I don't think today it's possible to write with the same, I mean, I am an optimist still, but I don't think it's possible to kind of think about the world with as much kind of unalloyed confidence and expectation as I did. I was also in my 30s back then, and I'm no longer in my 30s.
Yeah, I mean, that's what in an apartment and overlooking the Hudson River, and now you've, as you said, cut your hair and you have some kids, and as you talk about in the book. But it's a forensic investigation at some level of social epidemics. And so you talk about how if the world can be moved in just the slightest sort of push, and I love this, right? Then the person who knows where and when to push has real power.
Yeah.
How do you define social epidemics?
I define a social epidemic as any attempt to use the kind of contagious power of ideas and behavior to some effect. So if when we look at an epidemic, we see a proper epidemic of disease, we see a number of very characteristic traits. One, that there is contagion. Two, that change is nonlinear, that things explode all at once at a kind of tipping point. And three, that certain kinds of people have way more influence than others. Way, way more influence. And I think all three of those ideas are in some sense counterintuitive. We're always taken by surprise when change happens suddenly. We want to assume, I have a chapter on COVID and how the thing we didn't talk about during COVID was that only a small number of people who were infected with COVID posed any substantial risk of passing on the virus to someone else. COVID spread on the backs of a tiny, tiny group of people who, for some reason that we don't entirely understand, were emitting hundreds, if not thousands of times more virus than anybody else. That is true of many different kinds of epidemic behaviors. It's really hard for us to accept, right? If you went into a room full of 100 people infected with COVID and you said, I know you're all carrying the virus right now, but only 2 of you are really going to matter in terms of spreading it, people wouldn't believe that. It's just, so all of these, taking epidemics seriously is about overcoming our reluctance, our resistance to these kind of counterintuitive notions. I have a chapter on gay marriage, and the thing that was so striking about the gay marriage revolution was not just that it happened so abruptly and quickly, but that the people most taken by surprise by that were the activists fighting for gay marriage. So it's like, it was the people, you can imagine saying if you weren't following the controversy, you were stunned by, oh my God, in 10 years we went from being resolutely opposed to, no, it was the people who were trying to bring about the change who were amazed by this. Like, that's how these ideas are, these epidemic concepts are just really, really difficult. And though the people who take them seriously can have an enormous amount of power because they're doing something that no one else wants to do.
You unpack puzzles, as you call them, 3 sort of puzzles, various puzzles in the book, really. What are these, as you dove so deep into this forensic study at some level, what do these puzzles really illustrate, if we had to pull those out for us relative to the social epidemic and the tipping points? And maybe there's 1 or 2 that you sort of prefer to talk about more to illustrate these moments in time.
Yeah. So one of the puzzles is what I call the overstory. And I really could have written the whole book on overstories. It's really the thing that captured my imagination while writing it. But it started because I got really interested in Miami. And Miami is this weird place, and it's weird for any number of reasons. But one of the weird things about Miami is that it is the Medicare fraud capital of America. It's also the capital of all kinds of fraud, but Medicare fraud is one of them. And it's not just a little, Miami's not just a little bit different from other cities in this country in terms of how much fraud exists. It's hugely different. And this propensity of people in Miami to engage in Medicare fraud is not true of all of South Florida. It stops at the Miami border. So Fort Lauderdale doesn't have a lot of, Boca doesn't have a lot of Medicare fraud. West Palm doesn't have a lot of Medicare fraud. Miami does. So this turns out to be, and I just found this fascinating. Why would it stop at the border, and why Miami?
Right.
Why? What is it about? How could a city have that specific a culture that it would affect the criminality of behavior in a specific area? And so I sort of dug into it, and it turns out this is a well-known phenomenon, that there are various patterns of behavior that are clearly contagious, that are specific to communities. In medicine, we see this all the time. Medical practice patterns are incredibly specific. I have a whole riff about how the kind of cardiology care you would get in Buffalo is way different from the kind of care you would get in Boulder. Not worse, different. If cardiologists living in Buffalo just practice medicine differently, and then people who live in Boulder or LA, or it's these weirdly specific, and that I just found that so interesting, because how do you explain it? And the only thing I could come up with is that this kind of weird idea that there's certain kinds of ideas that are in the ether that influence us by virtue of where we live in ways that we're not aware of. People moving to Miami. I have a whole chapter about a guy who moves to Miami and then all of a sudden starts committing Medicare fraud. It's just the weirdest thing. But it helps us understand, because I had originally thought that what a epidemic was something by definition that did not respect borders.
Right.
That's our notion of an epidemic is COVID spreads everywhere. HIV
Right.
came out of I know this because both my kids have norovirus. There's a norovirus epidemic in Columbia County in New York,
Right.
and it's spreading all over this part of New York State. It doesn't stop at the border of Columbia
Right.
County. But there's another class of epidemics that do. And that's weird.
Right.
And so a third of the book is just devoted to trying to figure out what on earth is going on with these incredibly specific kind of patterns of behavior.
What did you recognize relative to these very specific patterns of behaviors, these incubated at some of the border restricted environments, like a Miami example? What did you recognize about that? And as a human being at some level, how do we become better at recognizing them ourselves in service of trying to potentially create a positive or more positive outcome?
Well, it says that culture is specific, and culture really matters. And I think that that's something that sounds both commonplace and also easy to dismiss. People are always talking about, the importance of culture and culture this. But I came out of this thinking, you know what? I'm a deep, deep, deep believer in the power of local cultures. When we say a school is a good school, what do we mean? Well, in part we mean that they have an unusually large number of able teachers, or they have a lot of students who score well on tests. But really what we're saying is there's a local culture inside that school, specific to that school, which empowers kids to learn in a way that they would not otherwise, right? And we can't identify necessarily where that culture comes from, where it started. It's not about who the principal is. I mean, the principals keep it alive, but it's not a case that these cultures, go away the minute somebody retires.
Right.
They seem to have a, in the case of Miami, this has been going on for years. We've cycled through generations of doctors and generations of criminals and generations of, they persist. There's something in the ether, in other words, that gets created and can persist, and gets kind of, and has this, like I said, has this power over us that we're not, always recognizing.
Yeah, and you have an entire section on social engineers, which at some level is sort of let's sort of figure out where is this sourcing from, and social engineers, and sort of at some level you talk about social engineering.
Mm-hmm.
What is that exactly, Malcolm? Because when you read it, and when you read about these very specific communities, schools, Harvard women's rugby, the Marriott example, as a reader, you go, well, geez, am I inside of one of these? Like, am I about to? So what is social engineering at some level, and who are these people, and how do we spot it?
Social engineering is any deliberate attempt to use the rules of epidemics to some end. And so I start that with a discussion of this little community, it's really just a bunch of homes on a cul-de-sac in Palo Alto, that in the 1960s and late 50s, at the height of the kind of white flight era, when white people were fleeing cities because black people were moving in, this community decided they wanted to put an end to that. And their idea was that there's a tipping point, and this was strongly suggested by a lot of research at the time, that when the number of incoming black people reached about a third of the overall population, all the white people would leave. That a third was, I call it the magic third in the book, a third was the tipping point. So what they said was, okay, we're going to have a community which is going to be a mixed, it's going to be white people, Asians, and black people. And the way we're going to keep it stable is by making sure that no group ever gets above that magic 1/3 number. And they do this little experiment, and it goes on for 20 or 30 years. And all around them, all over the country, cities are emptying out as white people flee to the suburbs in the face of not this community. They manage to keep absolutely stable and keep the three racial groups living happily next to each other by engaging in social engineering, by understanding there is a tipping point at which white fear becomes so palpable that white people will sell their homes and flee. We're going to acknowledge that tipping point and engineer the kind of residential agreements in our neighborhood such that we never go above that tipping point. So they had a rule: if you lived on the street, white people could only sell their house to white people, black people could only sell their house to black people. No group could ever get above the magic 1/3 number, right? It's a complicated, and I dig into why it's difficult, but it's an example of social engineering. A group of people at a time of extraordinary racial division in this country decided they would use the rules of epidemics to fight back. Now, that idea gets, another version of this would be, and I'm sure this is something that has affected you in your life, I talk about how many women do you need in a group before the women feel comfortable. And it's the same idea, that one woman in a group of 10 men is not herself. She's not, it is very difficult for anyone who is that kind of minority to perform at full capacity. They're being scrutinized, they're isolated, the group is simultaneously obsessing over them and ignoring them. I go into all sort of the literature about what it means to be a token. And then I did this whole thing on corporate boards and how people wanted to start putting women on corporate boards because they felt that women could bring really important perspectives to boards. But then the question was, well, how many women do you need on a board before you get the woman effect? And the answer is you can't just do one.
Right.
You must have a group of it. And the idea is that you need about at least three before. And I just find that's social engineering.
Sure.
So I'm Procter & Gamble. I'm selling my products to women, and I've had a board of 9 guys for 100 years. And I realized, wait a minute, no, I should have So I put one woman on the board, and it doesn't make much of a difference.
Right.
And then if I'm a social engineer, though, I'd say, no, put 3 on the board.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to all these. I got so obsessed with this. I just started calling women on boards and getting kind of war stories, and every single one of them said the same thing. It would be like, so these older women who have been through this transformation, and they would say, I was on my first board in, 1994,
Right.
and I was the only woman, and man, I would say things, and it was like I wasn't there, and as a woman tells a story, someone comes to give a presentation to the board, a consultant, and all the board members stand up to shake the consultant's hand, and the consultant skips over this woman, like she's not there.
Wow.
Doesn't see her, right?
Right, yeah.
And
No,
then
he sees her, he just doesn't see her.
yeah, exactly. Sees
Right.
her and doesn't see her. And then they would say, and I said, okay, so what happened when there were 2 of you on a board? They'd say, a little bit better, but still, what happened when there were 3? Oh my God. And they all said the same thing, Molly. It was so amazing.
Wow.
They were like, when we got to 3, it was like night and day. It was like all of a sudden we were, we weren't just friends. We had a position. We had a bulkhead,
Right. We were heard.
We were heard. You cannot ignore 3.
Right.
Right. You can't talk past 3. You can't. And if you're one of those 3, you're no longer feeling like you're scrutinized. You no longer feel like you have a pressure to conform, to play the man, to join the boys club, to do any of those things that you have when you're 1. I have to say that was part of the book where I didn't believe it. I understood the theory, but I didn't really deep down believe it. I thought, it's kind of like, this is a...
Yeah. Well, and so is there a correlation relative to, you talked about a third in the neighborhood. You talked about it, I mean, essentially that's probably close to a third, right, of the women on the boards. Is there something there when we think about social epidemics and social engineering relative to that 1/3 variation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's getting at... So really what this is an attempt to figure out what critical mass is. Mm-hmm. And it's also a reflection of how differently we behave in different groups. Mm-hmm. And I've actually thought a lot about this. I don't think that, the social engineers, one aspect of social engineering social engineers are people who think a lot about the composition of groups. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the composition of groups is something that's often last on our list of things we think about the quality of groups, but we don't think as much about the composition. And there's I have a whole thing in this chapter where I talk about the legal battle about affirmative action. And what was striking to me about it was how much of the debate on both sides of that issue was lazy and wasn't really interested in digging into the question of the composition of groups. It was like, one side said, we need more black people on campus. Mm-hmm. And the other side said, not if you're lowering academic standards. Uh-huh. And no one asked the question was, well, what exactly happens when you increase the numbers of a minority group on campus? How many do you have to have before you get a positive effect? Mm-hmm. If you're a black person, is it the same, black student? Is it the same if you're one of 5% as it is if you're one of 25%? Mm-hmm. What advice would you give it's funny, I thought about this because half of my family is Jamaican. One of my Jamaican cousins went to a mostly white school for undergrad, and then Howard University Law School. Okay. HBCU, Historically Black College, for law school. And she said, I said, what was that like? And she said, if I had known how different it was to go to a school where I was in the majority, I would never have gone to the undergraduate place I went. She went to George Washington. Wow. It just was like, she didn't get it. Like most of us, she wasn't thinking about group composition. She was thinking about herself. I'm a smart, able, she's very incredibly, works at some fancy law firm. There was no issue about her own credentials here. She had a whole range of choices. Mm-hmm. She chose the school that seemed to be the fanciest and whatever. And then she got this lesson in group proportions. She's like, And I, particularly the women part of this
Yeah, it's interesting.
is, to my mind, the most interesting. Because I feel like we've gone through this kind of mini revolution over the last generation, where without being explicit about it, we've been playing with group proportions.
Totally. Right. Sure.
And, people like, so my mom is 92. I feel like her life is about this transformation, that when she started getting actively involved in her community in the 70s and stuff, she was typically the only woman. And then by the time she kind of retires, she's one of many women. And she saw, like all these women I was talking to, she saw it.
Yeah.
She was like, man, it was hard in the 70s. Now I understand why, right?
No, but that is it. And so what's interesting is, as an individual who considers entering a group, whatever that might be, for me, Malcolm, I was a sports agent for almost 20 years, so there was no women leaning on fences, picking off ball players or on the range at tour events. So what role do we as individuals need to consider and play relative to being first and also recognizing the ability to, relative to sort of this 1/3 metric? How do you unpack that in your mind as you're maybe advising teams and leaders on how to create groups, but also be forward thinking and innovative, inclusive, all that?
Well, I would say that we should add this to the list of things leaders need to think about. Team formation it turns out to be an even more complicated task than we thought.
Yeah.
And like there's a weird little thing I talk about in the book about this really kind of preliminary work, but fascinating, that looked at black-white test scores. And if you go into any American classroom that has black students and white students, there'll be a gap in their test scores. White students will do, half a standard deviation better than black students. And they looked at that question, but they asked the second question which was, okay, how many black students are there in that class? And what they discover is, as the number of black students approaches 1/3, the test score gap disappears. So there's a case where, if you're a leader in an educational institution, what does that mean? That means that, first of all, you're making a mistake if you're analyzing someone's individual performance outside of the context of the group that they belong to. Or, when I say the group belongs to, I mean the classroom dynamic that they are learning in. And it says that you got to do some pretty hard, counterintuitive things, maybe. If this is true, I mean, it's just some preliminary work, but suppose it's true. You got to go to black parents and you should say, I have a choice to put your kid in one of 3 classes. I'm going to choose to put your kid in the class with the most number of other black students because I think it'll be better for your kid. That's a hard conversation.
Totally.
Right?
Sure.
It's also a hard conversation for the white parents who are going to be in that. Because we have this kind of, I think, deeply problematic view that the more white kids who are in a school classroom, the better off the black student is. Right? That's the way we've thought about this problem for 50 years.
Right.
What if that's not true? What if there's some kind of more complicated calculus going on? My point is that to be a leader in that context requires that you go beyond simple analysis of individuals and start thinking about groups. So if I'm the head of your sports agency and there's one woman who becomes an agent on my team and she's struggling, my first thought is maybe she can't hack it.
Right.
But maybe my first thought should be maybe I don't have enough women.
Right.
Maybe the correct response to a woman who's struggling is to hire more women. Do you realize how counterintuitive that is?
Totally. It's so, but you know what's interesting, Malcolm? I was in an organization and I was in a forum and we had 3 women and it was crushing it. It was wonderful. One dropped out, another one dropped out, and I was the one left. And after a little while, I sort of now at some level am putting the pieces together why I think I was feeling less and less inclined to want to stay a part of the group.
Yeah.
For exactly what you're describing.
Yeah.
So when you think about leaders and organizations, and we think about cultures and teams from a leader's lens, as we put teams together, groups together, in separate and apart from industry, what are the kinds of questions? What are the other kinds of questions that leaders should be asking themselves as they consider an optimal team? Like if Malcolm, if you could put together a team, how do you think about that based on what you learned through this process?
Well, I think it means, one of the things I think a lot about is the leader has to brace themselves for the notion that an effective team is not the same thing as a cohesive team. The cohesion is the problem here. Why do I want to surround myself with lots of people like me? Because it's easier. It's socially really easy. We all share the same background, think the same way. We all watch the same sports on the weekend. We golf. We whatever. That's easy. There's a limited amount of conflict. We all start from the same premises. When I do something, the rest of the group gives me encouragement and praise, because it's what they would do too. But when you understand that, actually, no, I would like to have I'd like to have way more intellectual diversity in my group. But the only way to achieve intellectual diversity is really to break up. You can't achieve intellectual diversity by bringing in one outsider. You got to bring in a lot of outsiders. And you have to brace yourself for what that means, which is those fun, we're all in this together, we all share the same perspective, days are over. And so I wonder I think what gets us into trouble as often as not is that we just have this strong default to the socially comfortable mode. In fact, a lot of what we call discrimination, I think, is actually not discrimination. I think that's too harsh a term. I think it is a human desire to be socially comfortable. That's what it is. It's easier. I always give this example. Why are all the firemen in New York City, or historically, they're all like Irish guys from the Bronx? It's because if you're an Irish guy from the Bronx, nothing is more fun than hanging out with other Irish guys from the neighborhood, right? It's just fun. And they were allowed by the political structure of that to fill the fire department with their own people, and so they did. Of course they did, right? Like, of course they did. They're not evil. They're just doing something that we do. Is why are everyone in the Supreme Court went to Harvard and Yale Law School? Why? It's because that's who they're. All the clerks come from those schools. Why? They're comfortable with them. It's the easiest thing in the world. They don't want to travel the whole breadth of the United States, interviewing kids from every school under the sun to come up with their clerks. No, they want to go to the same schools they went to. One visit. They get on the train from D.C. and they go to Cambridge. And stop in New Haven on the way. They hire, so those are the clerks they hire, and then to be a justice, you have to start as a clerk. And so you've locked in a system where everyone, and it's because that's what they feel comfortable with.
Sure. That is, and so the way that you sort of frame up the overstory, Malcolm, and I love the way you say it, that it's possible to know when and where these tipping points are, and to know who the people are that are driving them and take control of them. And as you say, which is cool, to build a better world. So Malcolm, as people listen to this, be it leaders, be it, pastors, be it stay-at-home parent, as human beings, what should we anticipate relative to the tomorrows as you unpacked this? I would imagine your brain went to, if I'm here in 2050 and I wrote this, what would this look like? What should we anticipate, and what is our role in making the world better in light of the content in this truly riveting book?
I think that, there are many lessons, but one that's worth talking about a little bit is, I think, that particularly in the chapters where I'm talking about COVID and about the law, what I call the very, very few, the idea that there's just a small number of people who play these outsized roles in epidemics.
Right.
Paying attention to the kind of edge cases, to the outliers, is really, really important. And I feel like we've taken our eye off that. Like, to give you an example, this was something I felt very strongly about during the couple of years ago, during all the George Floyd protests. There were two things going on simultaneously. One was right and one was wrong. The right thing was people finally woke up to the fact that crimes are committed by police officers against people of color, people in disadvantaged communities, and that this has been going on for way too long, and we are turning a blind eye to it. That 100%, I have written about this repeatedly in the course of my career. Like, no one's more passionate about it. There's a second thing, though, that was problematic, which was the conclusion that the behavior of these crimes that are being committed are symptomatic of something deeply wrong with the institution of policing. Wrong. Most police officers are not like that. This is a problem that's being driven by a small number of people. Now, you could ask the question, why are those people being tolerated by their police departments? Great question. That's the right question.
Right.
But there is not something fundamentally wrong with the institution of policing. Just as the opioid epidemic does not tell you that American medicine is rotten just because this was started by doctors prescribing. It tells you there's a small number of doctors who are rotten, and that small number can do an enormous amount of damage. Same with, like, the guy who murders George Floyd. He had a list of offenses as long as your arm. That guy was like single-handedly creating all kinds of social mayhem in Minneapolis. The typical police officer in that city was not. And I think we need to be much more aware of the fact that many of our social problems are embedded in very specific, I don't want to say marginal, but that's marginal groups. And that solutions involve focusing on those marginal groups. When I say marginal groups, I mean groups at the margin.
Right.
The core, don't waste your time trying to reach all 1,000 police officers in your police department. Find the 25 who are real problems and either fix them or get rid of them. That's where your energy should be. Same thing on the positive side, if we think there are a small number of people who play enormously large and important roles in spreading positive epidemics, let's spend our time finding them, acknowledging them, supporting them. So that would be a big takeaway for a more focused. We need to lose this notion that that there is a kind of egalitarian pattern to these kinds of behavioral changes.
And ask at some level better questions first, and dig maybe a little deeper first at some level is what I'm hearing you say. It's interesting, Malcolm. I have a book coming out September 3rd called Dynamic Drive. And, I would love your take on the fact that I think we live in this world where there is this enormous focus on achievements, trophies, outcomes, shiny objects, money, fame, all these things. And what I find remarkably interesting is that the most optimal moment in which somebody can become complacent often is after they've achieved. And I ask this only through the lens of what role does this play in what I believe can tend to be a society that is becoming not a society, but that there's an opportunity for people to attach to an outcome or a goal and then become complacent after. Or and I think that it also impacts what I believe is a high sort of a low failure tolerance. I think people want to avoid failing in the world that we live in. And so all of your work, when we think about social phenomenon, when you think about things like a lack of failure tolerance or things like complacency through your lens of social phenomenon, what comes up for you?
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Well, I mean, that we have the wrong definition of what a failure is.
Yeah.
I mean, I once wrote an article for the New Yorker years and years ago about the difference between panicking and choking, and pointing out that they're totally different.
Totally agree.
Panicking is what happens to you when you don't know enough in the crucial moment, and choking is what happens to you when you know too much and you're too focused on what you need to do, and when I told this, do you remember when Yana Novotná folded against Steffi Graf in a
Yes, totally.
in Wimbledon?
Yes.
And she was up wasn't she up 5-love in the third or in the second or something like that? It was something crazy, and then she just
vomited on herself fully, choked
beyond.
Yes.
It's not, she fails not because she doesn't know how to play tennis, but because she does. Mm-hmm. That she's so good and has been doing things so automatically, without even unconsciously at a high level for so long, that when she starts thinking, it falls apart. Because her thinking self is not as good as her unthinking self. Right?
Totally.
She's moved beyond. So she's playing like a beginner again. She did not panic, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Panicking would be if she's facing Steffi Graf and she realizes, I can't play tennis.
Right.
That's panicking. Right. I would be panicking against Steffi Graf. I'd be like, I don't even know how to... Right? But I only bring that up because, our attitudes towards failure, we use that word to encompass all kinds of different responses. And some of these responses are worlds apart.
Yes.
Like the kind of setback where you get a powerful lesson in what you did wrong, you get immediate feedback, you respond to it, there's an opportunity for you to respond to it positively, there's time and space for you to recover. That's fantastic.
Sure.
But there's another version of it that's disastrous. I gave this debate, I was asked to do this debate in Toronto a couple years ago, and it was a disaster. It was like one of the worst. I got killed, I got vilified, I behaved abominably.
Oh, wow.
And I did a podcast.
This wasn't the 10,000 hours.
No.
Okay, got it. Okay.
And then I thought about it, and I was like, you know what, I'm just not, I thought I was good at debating, I'm not. So I did a whole podcast episode about, I went to debate school. And I sat down with the people, had them analyze my tape, tell me what I did wrong, and they taught me all the ways to do it better next time. So when I think about it, that debate was a disaster, but it was not a failure.
Right.
Because I had an opportunity, if I wanted it,
Yep.
to do better.
Right.
To fix it, and I had room. I have an audience that is willing to stay with me while I figure things out, right? If that was the last debate I'd ever given, and after that debate it was so disastrous no one would ever let me debate again, that's real failure.
Right.
That's catastrophic failure.
Right.
And I sort of feel like what we need to do in society is to create more of the first kind and limit the second kind. And that, that will go a long way towards sort of ending the
fear of it, the avoidance
fear,
of it.
yeah.
Yeah, totally. No, I mean, right. I mean, there's failures that are, that you can avoid, and then there's ones that I think Amy Edmondson calls them, there's basic failures, there's complex failures, and there's intellectual failures, right? Like,
yeah.
So, Malcolm, if somebody's, this is so fascinating to me. All of your work is so fascinating to me. You're so brilliant. When we think about what you've done relative to this Revenge on the Tipping Point. As people read this, what do you want them to do most? What do you want them to think about most? Maybe feel most, do most, consider most?
I like the idea of people understanding that there are kind of principles below the surface that help us explain things. That's really, it's been a constant theme in almost all of my books, but it's quite explicit in this one. I want people to say, to look around them at their school board meeting and say, you know, there's one of me on this. There should be three of me. Or to look at, I have a whole chapter on, it's too complicated to go into now, but on Ivy League schools and why they are.
Oh my gosh, it was so interesting.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. I want people to look at that.
Women's rugby. Yep.
Yeah. I want people to look at that and say, okay, so now I understand why they're doing that. And then draw your own conclusions. I don't think what they're doing is morally wrong. I just think it's important for us to know that a school like Harvard is going out of its way to make sure that they have an adequate supply of rich kids. Just be aware of that. That's the game they're playing. All right. Does that diminish your respect for the institution? Maybe. It's probably a good thing if it does, right? So that's what I want. I just want people to be kind of conscious that games like this, or the George Floyd example I gave, you know, this, just to be clear, we're not vilifying police officers. I've had many encounters with police officers in my life, you know, as most of us have, and they have been almost uniformly positive. Most police officers are not.
Sure.
But there is a group that's not, and we need to make that distinction and act accordingly. That's the kind of thinking. When someone says all police are bad, I want someone to stand up and say, wait, are you sure?
Right.
Or are you talking about something else here? That there is an incredibly powerful and socially consequential minority within the institution that is responsible for a lot of what we don't want. That's a more intelligent. And I even feel the same way about people who despair about the political climate in America right now. That, to my mind, the right response is, don't despair. Most people, when you look at what you seem to think is disorder and chaos, it's a small fraction of people who are making a lot of noise. It's not. The person you're sitting next to, you know, on a Southwest Airlines flight to Orlando, is not an evil person out to do, you know. They have the same worries that you do. You know, they're not like just getting people to understand the kind of structure of behavior and conversation in a given community, I think is really important.
Get curious. For sure. So, Malcolm, I end with rapid fire. I'm going to hit you with some quick ones. You ready?
Yep.
What is the book you most recommend to people?
Oh, wow. There's so many that I love. I will say anything by the nonfiction writer Janet Malcolm. She's my go-to. She's the most important influence on my writing.
I love it. Wow. Janet Malcolm. Is that no coincidence there with the name?
No coincidence.
What podcast do you most recommend?
Other than my own?
Other than Game Changers with Molly Fletcher and yours. I mean, let's go.
Well, I'm a huge sports fan. I listen to Bill Simmons.
Yeah.
So I say Bill Simmons.
Yeah. What are you most excited about in the world, and what are you most worried about in the world?
I am most excited about so many things. I think, here's my basic view. I feel like I'm excited about what technology can do for us, and I worry about what politics will do to us. In other words, I think that we got half of the equation right. It's a race between how good our technology is and how bad our politics are. So I think technology may ultimately win and help us out more than... And in my lifetime, I have seen firsthand, as all of us have, the extraordinary things that people in entrepreneurs, business people, inventors, creators, what have done for the overwhelming mass of humanity. I mean, we've lifted billions of people out of poverty in the last 25 years. It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Like, totally phenomenal. Like, this is something to be so excited about and positive about.
For sure. So the show's called Game Changers. So one last question. Who or what, when you reflect on your life or you reflect on people in the world, dead or alive, who inspires you the most, Malcolm, and why?
Other than my mom,
Oh, that's
I guess
awesome.
that's cheating. Is mom cheating?
I think mom's great, man. I'm right there with you. That's it for me too. I think moms are no, yeah, no, we can go with mom.
All right, go with my mom is a incredibly calm, thoughtful, wise, open woman who has seen a lot and learned a lot and has never lost her humility and her dignity. And that is the most powerful. She's 92, if I can hit 92 and be anything close to what she is, I will be a very happy man.
What a gift. That's fantastic. I love it. Malcolm Gladwell, thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thanks for taking time to connect. This is awesome.
Thank you, Molly.